Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and kick things off. We're a minute or so at the hour and just want to fill in all the time. So I'm Jake Varn. I'm from the Pew Charitable Trust. For anyone that is unfamiliar, Pew is based in DC. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution. I find that most people seem to know us from our ads on NPR, so brought to you by the Pew Charitable Trust. My fellow colleagues work on everything from, they like to say, from penguins to pensions. I prefer to say from broadband to budgets. I joined the Pew team, which has specialized on state policy research last year from the National Governors Association. It was a really exciting time. I don't think there's ever been a more exciting time, perhaps, to be working in state broadband policy, which is what brings us to this panel here today. And I really want to thank not only NDIA for hosting this and inviting us here, Portland State for letting us use their facilities, but also all of you for taking the time. I saw the slate of other panels, and there's definitely a few that I want to check the recordings out on. So I appreciate all of you being here, choosing us among some healthy competition. And for those that are tuning in on the live stream at home. So today's panel, state funding, offices, policy. We're going to dive right in. I'm going to let our panelists kind of introduce themselves as well as talk a little bit about their states. We're in day 2 of this, so I'm sure everyone kind of knows how these things work, but just in case this is your first panel of the conference, there's a microphone right over there for Q&A. I have a few gentle softball questions for our state panelists, and then a few hard-hitting ones for Gilbert here from the feds. But otherwise, want to hear from you all, so as questions come to you, go ahead and start lining up, and we'll try to weave you in. Otherwise, we're here for an hour, so. Actually, Ernie, I kind of want to start with you here in the middle. So coming from the state of Washington, it's funny, we were talking about how it almost seems like you guys are quickly becoming a veteran in this space, even though your office was, I think, established in 2019, is that correct, 2018 or so?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit first about your role, a little bit about your background, but also how you've seen the state of Washington's program change from those early days to this kind of new wave of federal funding and opportunity for state programs.
Sure. Thank you, Jake. Just, again, to introduce myself, POSO on it now. My name is Ernie Rasmussen. I am the Digital Equity Manager for the Washington State Broadband Office. Been in that position as one of the longest tenured employees in the office for now 6 months. We've gone through a couple of different leadership changes because, of course, private industry is gobbling up people. And so we've lost some really good talent. Fortunately, that talent, along with some other partnership that we have in the state that does really good work also in other offices supporting the broadband work, really kind of laid a great foundation and gave us a framework from which to build. Even before the pandemic hit, even before we saw an influx of coronavirus relief funds and ARPA funds, we had state budget commitment to digital equity, and so my role was a result of that commitment. And I know that there's a lot of states that feel like, okay, we're scrambling to fill that role. But fortunately, through a lot of really good advocacy at the community level, and then legislation understanding what that advocacy meant, and along with, again, some of those other offices that understood the challenges, my position became a reality. And so we've been charged with, again, advancing digital equity across the state, along with, then there's, of course, we have the infrastructure side of the house to, deploying out some of those funds that are a result of the pandemic. So we've got some durability, we've got clear marching orders, and, we're looking forward to, being able to be in a position to handle and deploy the resources that are coming in the most equitable manner that we possibly can.
Yeah, I'll definitely come back to you on that for looking forward in the next few years. But Veneeth, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself as well, and Louisiana's program, maybe a little bit more of a newer kids on the block. Want to hear how that process has been going and how you're kind of approaching the strategic planning elements and community engagement portions.
Yeah, and before I begin, thank you to Portland State, thank you to the folks at NDIA, Amy, for coming. In fact, really big deal and tip of the hat for that Google partnership. I get pumped up when we start to see companies getting engaged in large ways. So if you think about what Google announced yesterday with NDIA, and then what they announced, I think last week with ARP, where they're focusing on digital skilling, you're beginning to see companies step up and understand that they don't have all the answers, and that's where all of you need to bubble up solutions that they can then pick up and adopt. And so really tip the hat to all of your hard work and to NDIA. So look, we've been at this slightly longer, maybe 10 months. So this job, it's felt like 10 years. And I'll tell you, I didn't have any broadband experience. My team didn't have broadband experience. And one of the things that we did when we went into this effort was that rather than reinventing the wheel, we needed to look at our elders who have experienced a lot of battle scars, whether it's Washington, Virginia, North Carolina, to understand what's worked and what hasn't worked, because they've gone through the challenges and they've gone through the struggles of, before the pandemic, articulating to their state general funds and to their state general assemblies for any sort of modicum of dollars to help support broadband. And so that learning has proved invaluable. I often like to say that where the art program, Louisiana's program, is really birthed out of Virginia and North Carolina is coming together. So I'll tell you how we evolved. 2019, in the late 2019, I think Governor Edwards had gone to an event with the National Governors Association and recognized that it was critically important to improve all things digital to increase the competitiveness of Louisiana from an economic development perspective, but also it was critical to help improve healthcare outcomes. It was critical to improve socioeconomic situations throughout the state of Louisiana. And so he came back and through an executive order created the Bell Commission, the Broadband for Everyone in Louisiana Commission. Before that commission really took off, pandemic hits, and so the legislature recognized that there needed to be an office, there needed to be a focal point to help to align both federal, state, and local resources to address it. And rather than make the effort of creating an agency or a sub-department, the legislature, in partnership with the governor, actually created an office. So then the governor's like, hey, is this something you want to do? I said, sure. And so I started March 29th. And one of the things that we tactically did was we put, obviously we have to do 50 things at once, but we put together a great team. And we created and stood up our first broadband grant program. Digital equity, digital inclusion is critically important because broadband is a luxury in Louisiana for a lot of people. In fact, in Louisiana, you have a minimum of at least 1.6 million folks that don't have it. 47% of whom are African American or Latinos, in a state that's 33% African American. And so we had to do a student body left to understand and dissect what those challenges were. And knock on wood, so far so good. We've been fortunate to lean on states and learn from folks like Ernie. We have been fortunate to lean on Amy and her experience in North Carolina and what all of you guys are doing. We are a firm, and then of course Jake and Catherine and Gilbert and his team. We firmly believe in politely asking for other ideas from other states like Idaho and what they're doing with libraries and saying, let's not reinvent the wheel, let's take it and localize it to Louisiana. And so I'm happy to share more, but that's how we've evolved and look forward to the conversation.
I can't believe you went through that without mentioning the name of your grant program, which is perhaps the best in the business.
So we like to eat in Louisiana. We have good food. We're talking about food. Our grant program is actually called Gumbo. Okay? But it's an acronym. and it stands for Granting Unserved Municipalities Broadband Opportunities.
Love it.
So there's a lot of fiber in Gumbo, and there's a lot of fiber in our program. So
Terrible.
we're happy.
Terrible.
I had to continue that.
I set you up for it. I
That's right.
I only have myself to blame. All right. Down at the end,
Yes.
Gilbert, thank you for joining us in this panel today. Love to hear about your role at NTIA, as well as giving a little bit of lay of land of how states can take advantage of this new federal opportunities and kind of what
Absolutely.
you're seeing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you first off to NDIA for convening this Net Inclusion Conference and for Portland State for hosting this conference. Like Jake said, my name is Gilbert Resendez. I work for the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA. We're a bureau of the U.S. Department of Commerce. I specifically work in our Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth, primarily with our state outreach and engagement. So I get to work with these two gentlemen up here and Jake in a different capacity through our State Broadband Leaders Network. So we convene state broadband leaders in all 50 states, the territories, and District of Columbia. Right now, twice a month. It used to say once a month, but it's now twice a month. And it is a forum for them to share information amongst each other on best practices in broadband and telecommunications policy. More recently, I've also been, we as an agency have been working on standing up the programs that we were authorized under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So when that legislation passed, NTIA was authorized 6 new programs totaling about $48 billion. So that's kind of a high level overview of what we've been doing. I have handouts because I'm a teacher at heart on the programs that we have. But that's a little bit about me and NTIA.
Thanks, Gilbert. All right, I have one more round of questions for our panelists, and then definitely want to turn it all over to you all. And if not, I'll just keep talking. So start thinking of those. Ernie, I want to come back to you. You mentioned how your role was built into kind of the establishing statute language. I know part of your charge is coordinating with tribal entities in your state. So I'd love to hear about that process and how your office incorporates tribal connectivity and uses that within the broader state strategic plan, within the policies that are formed.
Sure, thank you. And so we talk about digital equity, we talk about, DEI efforts. I just want to make very, very clear a distinction here. The relationship between the state of Washington, and it should be in any state, and a federally recognized tribe is a government-to-government relationship. It is not an equity relationship. It is not one where we start talking about we need to do this because it's a community of color. They are 2 sovereign governments, and you need to have that relationship, honoring that. It's your duty as a state government to have that relationship. Now, when we start talking about working with, the tribal communities, tribal organizations, then we start getting into, AIAN, American Indian, Alaska Native populations. Then we start getting into equity challenges, right? And so just want to make clear that distinction. But we see, again, 29 federally recognized tribes in Washington State. And when we work with in a true government-to-government fashion, and we honor that, and we work in partnership, and I love this challenge for partnership, and it was one of the things that I asked the Department of Commerce, Washington State Department of Commerce, was stop using the word help. Stop using the word help when we start approaching those communities and start talking about partnership. Even at the local level, even within the municipalities, stop saying, how can we help you? Let's start saying, how can we partner with you? And so, it changes that dynamic of a power imbalance. And you both bring something very tangible sometimes it's human capital, to the table, and that honors that human capital, honors that other community that's in that partnership. So we see that partnership as critically important to addressing this broadband challenge. With 29 federally recognized tribes having access to, now totaling almost $3 billion in funding, from the first round of $1 billion in funding, and now another $2 billion, to address this challenge, and actually, one of the things before I came to the broadband office was, as the tribal liaison at Washington State Department of Commerce, was said, challenged, if we serve every tribal community and get fiber into those communities, we're gonna hit so many communities in between. So if we make that a priority to partner with them to get them, those dollars there, we will hit so many different people, so many other communities in between, and the result will be, you know, we've addressed a big part of the challenge. And so, that partnership is, you know, on a policy level, we look at, you know, policy, places where we can do some, almost like a experimentation. We got an opportunity with tribal governments to push the boundaries on policy. We asked, you know, we partner with them to think about things like, the 2.5 gigahertz, you know, how can we make sure that that's something that we take advantage of? Tribal housing authorities for aggregate billing, you know, let's talk about that. You know, perhaps that's a place that we can push that up to the national level and demonstrate that it works. And then it becomes something that can inform our own federal policy. So, it's a really productive relationship. It's always challenging, because it's always, you know, you have to be mindful of the respect that's necessary, the sovereignty that's necessary, to ensure that everything you're doing is upholding and lifting that sovereignty, and you're not infringing upon it. So, but it's well worth it. It's well worth it in the long run. There's so many benefits to tribal communities, and it's not just tribal communities. It's you know, communities of color. You know, when we start talking about that, they inform our identity in the state, just as, you know, pretty much all the communities have a, you know, they inform us who we are, at the local level and at the state level. So, I mean, the football team even has like tribal art on its helmet, so, you know, it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, and I appreciate that we were just talking about the plenary session we just came out of, and the mindfulness of the language that you're using, and
Yes.
taking the time to at least to establish that. I appreciate that thought. Veneeth, want to turn to you a little bit from something that Louisiana has, unfortunately, a tremendous amount of experience with, which is responding to disasters and incorporating resiliency into an equitable funding program. I'd be curious just to hear your experience last year going through responding to the hurricane, and then as you're looking forward, how you're incorporating resiliency through this lens of equitable funding for broadband.
Yeah, so we've been getting our butts kicked by hurricanes. I mean, but what's scary about the hurricanes that have been impacting Louisiana is, I don't know if you guys remember, but when I was younger, you know, the teacher, social studies or geography teacher, would give you a little map, and then, you know, you'd set up dots along the path of the hurricanes. And these hurricanes would form off the coast of the Western Sahara, which they continue to do. And then you have a couple of days of lead time. These hurricanes, especially Ida, sort of spooled up in the Caribbean or off Cuba, and then within 48 hours it was over 125, 130 miles an hour. And so what was interesting and challenging about Ida was that if you think about it from an absolute perspective, it largely created, and this was scary, more destruction than Katrina, because it was more of a wind event, which means it knocked out more telecommunications infrastructure. And so in the course of knocking out more telecommunications infrastructure, there were law enforcement offices that were literally using pen and paper, going and jotting down addresses and then sending boats. There were families in Louisiana that were calling FEMA headquarters because there was no telecommunications, because there was nowhere to go, who would then route the calls back to Louisiana to say, hey, someone called from this area, can you please intervene? It crippled our telecommunications infrastructure. And it's largely because a lot of it's pole-to-pole and it's dilapidated infrastructure. So resilience is really near and dear to our heart. Resilience among community anchor institutions is near and dear to our heart. So this is what we've started doing. We've started looking at the community anchor institutions south of Interstate 10, which is what we largely use as our geographic demarcation line between North Louisiana and South Louisiana. And we've started identifying those community anchor institutions, which we include faith-based organizations, churches, hospitals, higher ed, public safety, the definitions of community anchor institutions. And what we've started doing is modeling out flooding, predictive modeling out where floods are going to occur, at what depth, because I think there's an opportunity to potentially use some of this infrastructure money to put a lot of that infrastructure underground and double down. So that's one thing. On the resilience part, north of I-10, as these hurricanes or natural events start to lose intensity, it becomes more of a wind issue even more in areas that may not have strengthened infrastructure. And that's where potentially cellular coverage can be helpful, right? FirstNet was down in Louisiana for some time. There's law enforcement that doesn't have basic internet in central Louisiana. And so that's why, as part of what we're looking at doing in our 5-year plan, is how do we strengthen resilience and infrastructure in areas that are not going to be directly impacted by hurricanes, but nonetheless impacted. Because if we double down on infrastructure that creates resilience, that'll impact farmers, in our case, because we are big into agriculture, that helps facilitate telehealth, and it helps to really accelerate efforts so that there is no digital gap that exists throughout the state of Louisiana. So resilience is a big piece. In fact, the governor wrote a letter to Secretary Raimondo, which I think it was well received. It was well received. And Commerce and NTIA has looked at the letter and a couple of valid points that we made that I think they appreciate was the fact that I think we should include and NTIA should consider resilience and high cost resilience in the calculation of their infrastructure money, because Washington's going to have sequentially different situations than we are, but nonetheless it all boils down to resilience, and so that's critically important. I was in Lake Charles, and I was in Lake Charles last week, which is on the border of Louisiana and Texas. Hurricane Laura, we're in 22. I think Hurricane Laura hit Lake Charles in 2020. They're still recovering, and I think it's going to take a lifetime to recover. Particularly, churches were impacted. African American churches were impacted, right? And so when I met with pastors, a lot of the challenges they have is, well, Veneeth, how do I increase and make our churches an increased access point so that we double down on resilience, we potentially put internet cafes in our churches, and we create even more opportunities to reduce the challenges of telecommunications post-disaster in a lot of events. So to your point, it's a complex challenge because there are different tactics and different approaches for different segments of Louisiana.
Appreciate that, Veneeth. One just follow up on that. A comment was made at the plenary session just before this that it's not about inviting community to the table, it's that the community is the table. And you have to go to them and make sure that they're incorporated. I want to just tee you up a little bit, talk about some of the road tours that you've been doing to get the word out and start connecting.
Yeah, so look, Louisiana geographically is a small state. We're not Texas, we're not Washington, which means we could cover physically a lot of ground. And when I say we could physically cover a lot of ground, what we purposely did at the very beginning and what we continue to do now is we regularly hit the road 3 or 4 times a week. You could go to North Louisiana from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and it takes about 3.5 hours, a 3.5 hour drive. So we'll try to hit as many different small towns. And in every small town, you'll have all of the relevant stakeholders attend that meeting. Sheriffs, hospital execs, Farm Bureau, LSU Ag Extension Office, Southern University Ag Extension Office, local librarians. You have local chambers of commerce. So it's critically important that they tell us what the reality of the situation is and what's important to them, because 64 parishes in Louisiana, it's a 64 parish challenge. The other issue, I wouldn't say challenge, but we're working through it, is there is a big knowledge dislocation between states, state leaders, and locals. Locals will say, I need it, but they don't know what that effectively means. They think, oh, you just build the road and there you go. But this is where the fulcrum and really the the success of these projects, I think, look, my job is gonna be relatively easy. Grant program, execute, and then we report to Gilbert and his team, right? But the success of this digital
Easy peasy.
divide, correct.
What else? What else is there?
The success of, that's what I think, but maybe I'm a little bit too new still. But the success of these problems has to be driven locally, which is why we spend a ton of time on the road. We've probably been to 50 small towns throughout Louisiana. They appreciate it. They're like, oh wow, you're coming from Baton Rouge, going to a small town of 500 people. They thoroughly appreciate it. They're grateful, and they're willing to roll up their sleeves, which is why we feel bullish we're going to solve this problem. So.
Gilbert, I'm not just gonna let you sit down there
I
with
didn't
all the
think
money
you
in
would.
your hands.
That's right.
I didn't think I'd get out of it.
You mentioned that NTIA is working very closely with the states, very frequent contacts. So I imagine you have an interesting lens into how states have been developing over the last few months, few years, the programs that are being stood up, the offices being created. Curious to hear some insights beyond the great work that's happening in
Absolutely.
Washington, Louisiana, what you've seen kind of popping up around the state that is useful to highlight.
Yeah, absolutely. So starting in, I believe, summer 2018, I think that's when I was a baby intern at NTIA, we began a regular yearly research project called our state scan process. And in those documents, we have information on state broadband funding programs, what states have plans, what states have data and mapping initiatives, what states are standing up their own grant programs, and most recently talking about or researching and looking at how our states leveraging other federal investments. So that's ARPA, CARES primarily. We have seen a tremendous amount of growth and engagement from the states. We have states that have who have never really put together broadband plans, who are now putting together broadband plans, really looking at how can they leverage a lot of the different federal funds and not just their own funds to deliver broadband in their states. We're here in Oregon. Oregon most recently just published a broadband plan in 2020 and used about, I believe, $10 million of CARES funding and then some of their ARPA capital projects funding as well to stand up a grant program for rural expansion in the state. So this is becoming a much bigger piece of, or a much bigger role that states are playing. They're leveraging a lot of other funds, but they're also looking at that digital equity piece. And what I've seen in my time at NTIA is that more and more states are also starting to incorporate digital equity in their state broadband planning and in their state broadband programs, be it a standalone plan or incorporated as a embedded piece to their state broadband plans.
Appreciate that. And it might be useful just to lay out a little bit of kind of where we are in terms of the federal funds that just passed, the bureaucratic machinations of actually
Sure.
making those funds available. The request for comment came out for the BEAD funding, but appreciate if you could just walk through a little bit and what
Absolutely.
states could expect and when.
Absolutely, yeah. So the infrastructure bill passed with no small part as the work that people in this room did to help get that across the finish line and into legislation. That's everyone here from NDIA to people working at the state or city and community levels. Like Jake said, we recently published a request for comment, which is, I believe, actually for all of our programs. So NTIA was authorized 6 programs. That's the BEAD program, the Broadband Equity and Access and Deployment Act. Thank you, Amy. It's a lot of acronyms. The Digital Equity Act, which authorized 6 programs, an Enabling Middle Mile program, and then a tribal grant program. So NTIA just, like I said, closed the request for comments on those programs. We are currently reviewing those comments and writing our notice of funding opportunities for those 6 programs. I believe statutorily BEAD has a timeline of about mid-May, so you can be looking for more information from NTIA around then. We are also, you can expect some information from DEA around the same time, just based off the statutory timelines. We have also been busy taking public comments in other forums. NTIA recently has been putting on a virtual public listening session for those programs and is moving into other sorts of educational pieces and webinar format on those. So we are working hard. I know it's hard to see that when you're at outside looking up. We are working hard, reviewing the public comments. Thank you to everyone who did submit comments. I know that's no easy feat. I know there was a quick timeline on those, so thank you. We are taking that into consideration, are committed to taking in a diverse stakeholder feedback.
Ernie, I have one more question for you, and then I expect some people to start lining up with questions of their own. I know this is not a shy group by any means, but Ernie, I just asked Gilbert to rattle off the list of programs, and I realized I kind of neglected to give you a chance to walk through all of the different programs that Washington's office has stood up in the past few months, as well as looking to stand up. So I wanted to give you a chance to just share all the good work that you guys have been doing.
You know, it's one thing to sit here as a representative for the broadband office and say, you know, like, hey, we've done really good things. You have to acknowledge, you know, again, what has been done prior to that to get us to this point. And so we have a couple of different efforts that are outside of the state broadband office that are kind of like this board level work that happens within the Commerce Agency. And so the Community Economic Revitalization Board is one that brings out and brings funding to communities in the form of either planning plus infrastructure. It works to facilitate the public-private partnerships that are necessary and that's been going on for years. And that's served as a model of what is possible for the broadband office. Public Works Board, which is another one, it's another partner. They're a granting agency, and they're doing similar work, with a lot of infrastructure type work, working with ports, port authorities, and just, you know, again, so we've been able to glean some of the best information to get to the point where we've got an opportunity to just build off from their good work that's already been done. So with that, we've got our again, the infrastructure side of things. We're rolling out infrastructure funding. We got two different tranches of funding that we've already gone through one, and we've got a second one coming up in April. Most recently, you know, the most recent award cycle, we provided a $16 million grant to a tribe to build out fiber that extended beyond the borders of the reservation. It was just, I mean, it's just one of those things, again, where we saw that partnership on a local level with a federally recognized tribe result in a substantial benefit to a number of different stakeholders. So we've got the infrastructure side. Then on the digital equity side, we've got a statewide digital navigators program where we're working with, at this point, because we were so new and we have staffing issues, we've got 4 contracts with 4 statewide providers for digital navigator services. One of them has a workforce development focus, another has a healthcare focus, another one with an education focus, and then the 4th one is a public housing authority in an urban area. And so, you know, we're learning from those efforts. You know, we're collecting data to give really kind of a better understanding of, you know, what's some of the most effective ways for us to do this work. And then perhaps, and you and I just had this conversation in the hallway about what's a bit innovative about us, and because I've got a staff member who's like, I want to do the digital equity planning piece, and I'm like, you know, everybody's going to do that because all states are going to be required to do that. And he's like, I want to do coalition building, and I'm like, we're all going to do coalition building. But the one thing where I think Washington State is standing out is we're working alongside the Washington State Office of Equity to put together a digital equity forum, and that forum will result in, and you know, we've got a clear output that with a legislative report that is going to be due on January 1 of 2023. Yet the outcomes are, again, we see as much bigger. Just as we heard from the plenary session, you know, around structural racism, we are challenging ourselves to have these conversations in the most equitable manner that dismantles structural racism in our own shop, across communities. And so the Digital Equity Forum provides us that mirror that lets us know, hey, we have our own challenges internally at the state government level, in our office, and in the programs that we are designing, so that we can begin to meet, again, people in their communities and serve them in the most equitable manner. So that, again, is probably what I find to be one of the most hopeful and exciting things that we're doing in Washington State, and I'm just looking forward to continuing that work.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we're dwindling through the time. Not seeing any audience questions yet, but I know you're all busy thinking away. If you do have one, there's a microphone right over there. Oh, all right, now I get it. Y'all forgot about the microphone? I see how it is. All right, I will have one question for all of you to give final thoughts at the end, but I want to turn over here. So if you could just introduce yourself, say your name and the organization for the folks at home that can.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dylan Baker, I'm with the Idaho Commission for Libraries. We're the state library agency for Idaho. Just a real shout out, this is great, this is fantastic. We've been selected in Idaho to be the digital equity agency to do the state plan for Idaho. And we've been working a lot with Eric Force. Some of you may know him at our commerce office. He's our broadband office. But I was going to ask, since all the states are going to be developing these digital equity plans, beyond this group that we're all here with, NDIA, any other avenues, resources, communication platforms you see for all of us that are going to be doing this kind of work in individual states to collaborate, share best practices, successes? Is that something Pew can help us with, or others? Anyway, so any input on that would be great.
Yeah, I have a few plugs that I'll drop in at the end, but curious to hear from you all for what's been helpful. I don't know, who wants to take that first? Gilbert, do you have any that come to mind?
Well, I think you're doing one of the big pieces. I'm going to say work with your state broadband person because Eric Forsch is connected with the State Broadband Leaders Network and works with myself and these folks and can facilitate that. I would also give a plug for NTIA's new Digital Equity Leaders Network, which is similar to the State Broadband Leaders Network, but not exclusively people working in state broadband. It's a little bit more broad. I think that's also a great place to be plugged into to work with people across the country at all different levels of government who work on digital equity. Thank you.
For Idaho, I think you have the good fortune of having some federally recognized tribes that are doing really good work. Danae Wilson for the Nez Perce she's a rock star in her field. She understands the challenges and how to navigate those. And perhaps most impressive is that now you have a policy partner. You've got somebody who really understands how to navigate and gain the momentum across the Pacific Northwest, and then get it to a federal level and gain that momentum with the collective voice from all tribes to really kind of get more resources to dedicate to this work, because it's one thing to get the infrastructure there, but it's another thing to really get people to understand how it's going to serve them, and really be able to fully take advantage of the opportunity that's now there in their laps. And so that's I think you have that good fortune of having those folks with you.
So look, we're going to lean on Amy and Jake and the guys and Gilbert and frankly all of you guys. But I think what's really important in sort of our theory of change in Louisiana is the primary, secondary, and third goal is to solve the functional needs of access, affordability, literacy. But I also think that since we're all relatively operating from a blank sheet of paper, that we have this awesome opportunity to look at how do you leverage and converge broadband and digital equity from using it as a platform, using it as an asset, and using it as an enabler. I think that's where you start to drive real change, in addition and on top of the functional needs that we're going to solve by making all these investments on the access. Like, what does it mean for a family that's challenged by healthcare? Which is why we find what Blue Cross Blue Shield is doing in Idaho with the libraries as really compelling arguments to increasing access. Because you're solving the functional need, but you're also solving the healthcare need, right? And that's using broadband as a platform to do that. And so as you guys and gals start to build up these digital equity plans, I just think it's also important to start identifying and building based off stakeholder engagement what you think those use cases are going to look like around broadband being an asset, platform, and enabler. That's what we're doing. That's helping us inform the development of our 5-year plan, and that's what we're going to pitch to, of course, NTIA with hopeful approval once we submit it. But that's the worldview that we're taking it from Louisiana's perspective.
I'll just throw in a few other quick plugs before going to our next question. Yeah, this is something Pew will be tracking, of course, the resources put out. The National Broadband Resource Hub is a new database for resources and toolkits. And then NDIA, of course, has a litany of best practices and are developing toolkits for all of that. So, and there's folks here in the room that can answer more about that as well. All right, sorry.
Hi, Stephanie Stenberg from Internet 2's Community Anchor Program. Obviously, with all the funding opportunities, everyone is beating down the door of their state's broadband office.
Yes.
So do you have any advice for state or local organizations for how to help and how to be effective and how to offer actual help and assistance to the broadband office rather than just saying like, us too, give us some money too?
Yeah, so the question is how can state broadband offices offer?
How can organizations that want to work with the state broadband office be effective?
Yeah, I think reaching out and making sure you can form those partnerships. States are, as you mentioned, very, very busy. I know there are many states who are willing to start partnering to offer that assistance.
I think a lot of folks like to think that you need something, and they have forgotten to listen to what you actually need. And oftentimes companies or folks would say, Veneeth, this is what we can do for you and for you guys. And we often go back and say, we appreciate your wanting to help, but let me walk you through what we've done, where we see the challenges, and if there's a fit, and where we think there are gaps in our team that could be solved by building a relationship with someone who can help, then that's where we see value added, and that's where I think those kinds of relationships will have much more meaning. Because we have to be really careful, because obviously it's federal funds. We have to be very careful, but we also have to be very careful that we continue to build trust with locals. Because locals have, especially in rural Louisiana, have a great deal of apathy in terms of, yes, I'm happy something's coming, but will it ever happen? And so that's why we have to be really prescriptive in the relationships we have with folks based off, based off sort of what we take as the Silicon Valley approach in our office, which is let's identify a problem, let's develop a minimum viable product, let's push it out, let's iterate based on feedback and continue to improve. So it's that process improvement that's important.
Ernie, anything to add to that?
We view the community level partnership as probably the foundation for the work we have going forward. And that coalition building, again, I'm just gonna go back one more time and say, recognize the work that was done even before the broadband office came around. And that coalition building was already being done for years through what we call broadband action teams. And what we did to form them was really kind of this idea. It became almost a funding requirement early, years ago. It was almost a funding requirement that you had to have a broadband action team, and it had to be consisting of several different stakeholders, community anchor institutions, and even ISPs were encouraged to be at that table, so that you had this open conversation about. We all can agree, yes, broadband is important. And it's even more important than ever. But how are we gonna go about this? What's our plan? What can we all agree on a community level? And that's gonna continue to be a foundation of our digital equity planning. You know, so we view that as at the very foundational level. It's gonna inform our state level work, so, coalition building, and then making sure that you've got, that broad cross-section of your community and what it looks like, so.
Yeah, I would just put a button on what Gilbert said at the beginning too, that a lot of state offices are starting up for the first time in some states, or are very quickly trying to expand from 1 or 2 people to a full staff. So the more I think that they can hear from you all that do have resources available, or do have skills data or programs that you want to make sure that they know about, now is a very good time. Sarah, do you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Sarah Procaccini. I'm with DC, and I am very curious about how state broadband and large municipalities are building out their offices to facilitate these new programs. And I know that I have a team of 6, and we're located in this office, and our programming is done with these agencies, and we're getting money from all these places, and my team has a certain set of skills, but now we've got $100 million coming, and and right now, I have no visibility to how Louisiana is organized, to how Philadelphia is organized, how many staff, how do you do it? And I just feel that right now, as we're starting to feel the influx of more programming, understanding how other places are scale, like how you're building capacity in your own organization, and how you're thinking through, what projects are good public private partnerships, how are those kinds of things. I think now would also, we talk a lot about the kinds of projects we do, but how we're kind of managing that whole portfolio, that would be super helpful. So,
And as a DC resident, I can go ahead and say that we can just keep referring to it as a state broadband office.
well,
And we'll just leave it.
but my city partner.
Yes, cities. We'll keep state in there too, though, hopefully. Just to add another flavor to that as well, we're very curious to hear how Louisiana is thinking about skills assessment for your office structure. Well, actually, really all 3 of you, how your offices are developing different positions, where you're doing those needs analysis, and how you're starting to build out those structures.
Yeah, so I used to live in DC, so still have my 202 number. So it scares a lot of people in Louisiana when I call them for my 202 number. But I said, we're friendly 202 folks. So this is what we did. I mean, for us, I didn't have a whole lot of time to plan very deliberately, and I'll tell you sort of what we did. So functionally, we report to the Division of Administration. The person I report to is the Commissioner of Administration, who is the governor's chief budget person. Wanted to be close to that person. And so I report directly to him, and I have a standing conversation one-on-one with the governor, I think every 6 or 7 weeks. So that was the first decision point that we made in our broadband office, was to be close to the guy that's gonna have all this money. And I think in North Carolina, it's a very similar structure. So one of the things that we did very quickly was we actually looked at Pew's analysis on how other states have staffed. And I basically said, look, I need 3 FTEs, myself plus 2 more FTEs. And he said, you got it. And I said, I also need a 3-year commitment. And he said, you got it, because we can't solve this in 1 year. So I found someone who I had worked with, who had worked with me at the mayor's office in Baton Rouge, who had this very, very studious, very academic, who had a great skill set in drafting rules, looking at policy, and creating the grant program, which I tasked him to do. And I said, here, that's you, and we'll work together. And then I had someone actually work on the technology side on executing the grant program. As we start to look, so we're okay now. We're not gonna be okay in 5 months.
When you get their money.
When we get their money. In fact, they're gonna likely do the speed breaks and say, I'm gonna give you guys this money, how are you gonna execute? And so we've been actually working with Pew on creating an expanded office flexing out from 3 FTEs to, I believe, 11 FTEs, of which 4 or 5 of those would be sort of exclusive contractors, and then the balance would be people we would actually bring on board in civil service.
But would they be grant managers then? Like.
So we would.
And sorry, just to say what you're saying into the mic for folks at home, she's asking if those would be grant manager positions
Yeah,
as
okay.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be. I mean, we're gonna have to find folks that will focus on managing the grant, reporting. That's gonna be a very big deal. We're gonna hire someone to focus on digital equity and inclusion, maybe 1 or 2 FTEs. We're gonna have probably 2 FTEs focusing on community engagement, but also comms, right? We have to communicate this stuff over and over. One thing that we learned is, just like what my mom tells me over and over again, right? We have to keep repeating and telling people and just reminding people and educating people, right, about what's going on. So we're going to reflect our new office and staff to reflect all of this federal resources coming in. The other thing is, and this is just me personally, myself and my colleagues, we didn't have broadband experience coming in. I think sometimes there's this notion that you need to have years and years and years and years of telecom or broadband expertise to be successful in running a broadband office. I would vehemently disagree, not to say that I just think you need people that can quickly identify what the challenge is and through tactics quickly execute solutions. Which means I think it may be sometimes good to have non-broadband, non-telecom people actually involved, because they come in with a fresh perspective. I headed economic development for the city of Baton Rouge. I didn't have broadband experience. The guy that worked with me was sort of our junior economic developer as well. The other guy worked at Louisiana Economic Development running a digital media tax program, right? So for me, I just need passionate people that will roll up the sleeves, that will just quickly immerse themselves on a particular topic, in this case broadband, and run through brick walls to get it done. And so as we look at that kind of skill set, that's what I'm looking for, which means we may actually skew younger and then train these folks up. Because we've got Pew, and we've got NDIA, and we've got NTIA, and we've got a bunch of organizations that can help us with that process.
Really quick, just if you want to jump in on that, give you a chance to.
Right now, the way we exist, we've got basically 2 arms to our org chart. We've got the infrastructure, and then we've got the digital equity side. We're kind of running almost redundant, like contract management on both sides. And we're actually talking about reorging and creating just operations where we have all that contract management in one shop. We do digital equity, and that's what we do well. We're not worrying about contract management. We do infrastructure, we do it well, and we're not worrying about contract management. We're looking at reorging and basically specializing in certain areas so that we're not running these systems of redundancy, and it just creates some greater efficiencies, and of course, growing from, I think we're currently at 8 or 9, I'm not sure, and jumping up to as much as 18, I think at some point. So yeah.
One note, just before we move on to the next question, that Veneeth mentioned is the dedicated staffing for multiple years, that this is not just a one-time influx. One thing that came out in Pew's Promising Practices report in 2020, which came out, it was written pre-pandemic, was really that state broadband offices that already had an entity, already had staff people, were a leg up on those that now had to rehire an office that maybe existed in 2009 and 2010, and then funding lapsed and sunsetted. So building in that longevity and institutional experience. All right, we have a few more questions and we're running out of time, so we got to go quickly. Go ahead.
Are any of you concerned about silos at the state level?
Oh, I think you turned it off. You may have turned off the microphone. But if you go ahead and ask a question.
Are any of you concerned about creating silos at the state level where national solutions may not be able to be applied across different states as the money is coming through the states? And sometimes there's a mandate or a request that has to be spent within the state. Thank you.
So just quickly, in our case, the governor has has brought on within his administration an infrastructure coordinator that's coordinating through all the agencies. And they're working with all of the, in fact, we have a workshop with all these, with us, LADOTD, the cybersecurity folks, workforce development folks, the Office of Disabilities, et cetera, in a couple of weeks to coordinate all of this federal, if I am understanding your question, that's coordinating all this federal money that's coming in, looking at all the competitive grants, the non-competitive grants, and to understand where, for example, electric vehicle charging stations will all need fiber broadband, how we could work together to addressing some of these things.
Next question, thank you.
Hi, my name is Benya Kraus. I'm one of the co-founders of Lead for America. This past year, we stood up a national service fellowship partnership alongside Land O'Lakes across 16 states, 50 fellows, trying to bring local capacity to local organizations that are applying for broadband grants or digital equity programs. I have really appreciated hearing you all talk about how you're thinking about local capacity for your state broadband offices. I'm curious when it comes to local capacity to make sure that people are ready to apply for these grants. Are any of your grant programs going at right off the bat technical capacity? Does that come from the state level? Does it come straight from NTIA? Just curious how you're thinking about local capacity building. Thanks.
Ernie, I believe Washington has pre-planning grant funds.
Yeah,
available.
there's still challenges, trust me. The local capacity issue is a big one, and it goes far beyond broadband, but we do a couple of different things. We have a suite of services where we provide what's called rapid design studies that gives kind of some understanding of like what's the scope of your challenge in your area. Then we follow that up with grant writing services, and then from there we actually have a federal match program to try and get the where we still need to develop though is are some grant management skills in those communities. It's the last thing communities want is to get this influx of funding and then find out that they're not in compliance. They don't know what to do with it. They don't. They're now challenged with dealing with all of that, with all those resources. So that what you're saying, and I've been writing down fellowship this whole conference is we need more of that, especially in our rural communities, where we know that the outflux of human capital has been a result of the lack of broadband, really largely, and so we need to bring that back. And so how do we again create systems that are going to result in youth leading and staying, so that we're able to retain those folks.
Yes, the answer is yes. We would like an APC, American Connection, or actually ACP fellow in Louisiana.
Yep.
So I'm just going to be shameless in asking. So yes, we've been talking to Matt Woolman about, please send us someone. So that could work in that capacity.
Hi, I'm Amy Huffman. I'm the Policy Director for NDIA, and thanks to all of you for being here. Really appreciate it. Just sort of doubling down on one of the questions earlier and following on the session from last time, or the structural racism session. So you both are really doing a wonderful job about understanding that the community is the table and going to the communities to be part of that table in your roles. For all of our affiliates that may operate in states where the state leaders and broadband leaders aren't practicing that, how can they pull up a seat to the table? And how can you advise them to be part of that conversation in a way that's productive but also helpful for the states? And then finally, Ernie, I'd love if you could talk a little bit about the concept of centering equity through your work and how you've talked about that before for this audience.
Sure.
Thank you.
Do you want to start on that note?
Well, let's begin with
broader-
that.
Yeah.
Let's
go for
begin
it.
because we really like to say we are leading with equity. We are not centering equity. We are not putting on an equity lens because that can be taken off and utilized whenever you want to. No, we are leading with equity, and the question becomes then how? How are you doing that? And we're still defining that. We're still learning what that means. But we again, this Digital Equity Forum is one of those. The digital navigators of being able to touch on several different sectors. A commitment to working with Medicare and Medicaid patients, and a commitment to working with communities of color, Again, honoring that government-to-government relationship with tribes. So leading with equity is really what we are attempting to do. And then the other part of your question, being able to, so we actually have some legislation right now that we're working through that hopefully we get it to the point where actually we are compensating at a high level of pay people with lived experiences. You know, in some of the previous work that I've done in this type of work, there were some eyebrows that were raised even on like National Science Foundation projects that we were going to give, you know, tribal members that were coming in and informing a project, you know, $200 an hour. And they were just like, are you kidding me? I go, well, they're an expert. They're an expert, you know, and so, and the heartburn that was normally associated with coming to the table, asking those folks, actually, we call it just kind of creating the space to the table, you know, just create the space for allow people to come to it. And that heartburn of being invited and feeling tokenized becomes a lot less of an issue. They feel much better like they've been truly honored for their time, their energy, their story that they're sharing with you. And so adequately compensating people for their lived experiences is really a big piece to what we're trying to do anyway.
All right, I'm noticing that we are trickling over time, so I want to give you all just the last few seconds to talk a little bit about leaning forward, looking at the next 5-10 years, kind of how your office is approaching it and what the vision you have for your programs. And then we'll make Gilbert go last.
Look, I'll just tell you personally, I think what the pandemic has taught me is it is really difficult to plan 5-10 years. Mm-hmm. I remember sitting in the Superdome on January of 2020, watching LSU beat Clemson in the national championship with all these grand plans for 2020. And then 60 days later, it's all for naught, right? And so I just think, and our philosophy has always been, and I know NTI will probably close their ears, is plan enough to be dangerous, but our philosophy is not to over plan something to death, because if we do, and I think it was tweeted or was mentioned, don't make maybe it was at another event, don't make that solution perfect, right? Because then what happens is we feel really guilty when we hear from people who have the sense of urgency to try to solve the problem in their household. I've heard horror stories of Veneeth. It costs me $3,000 a month. I hear horror stories about the fiber line is right in front of me, and I call so-and-so company, and they're asking for $10,000. I live on a fixed income. How do I do a telehealth visit? So we have to operate at the same level of urgency that people need this stuff. And so, you know, it is really difficult for us to plan 5-10 years in advance. Planning is important. Doing it with data and doing it enough to be dangerous is really important, and then we execute. If we make a mistake, we learn quickly, and then move on.
Well, in that spirit, and having made a mistake in saying, I ask you to think 10 years in advance, Ernie, how about 1 or 2 years?
That's right.
Yeah.
So,
My bad.
so, you know, working in the tribal planning field for years, communities that are in crisis don't have the pleasure to plan.
Right.
They need to address the crisis now. So it's that whole idea of like, if I'm gonna teach a person to fish, well, they're hungry now.
Right.
They're hungry now, so you need to address that now. You need to take care of that crisis now. They're counting on us to plan. They're counting on us to come up with, you know, some form of a plan. I like the idea of data, but I don't want to be data-driven on everything I do. There's room for qualitative data. There's room for stories. There's room for, you know, those personal interactions, that opportunity at the table. If you're not listening to the voice, you're inviting that voice to the table. You're creating space. If you're not listening to it, and you're saying, but the data says otherwise, you're gonna, you know, again, you're losing that trust.
Right.
That trust is so critically important for those communities, and so 2-3 years from now, again, we address the crisis as much as we possibly can, and we continue to be that develop that trust that's necessary and identify the data sets that are gonna help guide us, but yet still create that space, so.
Final thoughts, Gilbert?
Yeah, 1 to 2 years out. For us, I think the final or what we're looking forward to in the future is how do we continue to facilitate these relationships with states and communities. It's not lost on us that this is a historic investment in broadband. If you look at the whole infrastructure bill, I believe it's about $65 billion. NTIA has about $48 billion of those dollars. So it's not lost on us the historic nature of this, and it is. Catherine Bates and I say it often, the success of states is the success of the nation. And ensuring that we can support and empower them to do the work that they need to do, and working with communities and us, the federal government, is what's really priority for us.
And Gilbert has handouts for
And
everyone.
I do have handouts.
All right, I want to thank all of you and thank our panelists.
Thank you, appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.